Hello, everybody, and even if you don't have a body, according to our podcast analytics, the single largest percentage of our viewers and listeners are unintelligible, immaterial entities from beyond human ontology. So I hope they're listening, and they'll just go ahead and bless our work. And today, that work consists of a follow-up interview with my fellow Ontarian, Jason Medland. Regular fans of these discussions will remember that he and I discussed Freemasonry, social systems, truckers, the sacred use of aggression, the necessity for ritual and ordeal, fragility and corruption in social and computational organization, and what kinds of wisdom are worth writing in stone. Today, we're going to push deeper into some of that terrain, and I'm happy to have him back with us. Hi, Jason.
Hey, Layman. How are you doing today?
Good. Fantastic. First, I just thought this would be interesting. What would be your criteria for this being a successful conversation?
If I'm able to effectively articulate the ideas I'm thinking of.
Okay. How would you class those ideas? What's the general topic that's on your mind?
Well, to start with the whole idea of the religion is not a religion. And so a couple of different steps in that. Can we stop, if it's a relationship with spirit that isn't defined in orthodoxy, can we just call it a mystery tradition? Because we have existing words for that stuff. We don't need to reinvent the wheel there. So if that is what a religion that is not a religion means, then let's just start using the term mystery tradition. I think that is what people are trying to describe in this space.
That's an interesting one. Let me just pop in there, because I really notice a difference, kind of like a temperamental difference in people about how they like to language these things. When people run into something they're not sure of, it seems like about half of them think they want to drop the old term and invent a new term. They want to rebrand it somehow. And the rest of the people think, well, no, I'm having a new insight, and that insight should be part of the definition of the thing I was already talking about. You're leaning a little bit more in that direction. Like, if we're basically doing this old thing, why don't we just use the name we already have?
Yeah, that goes back to the lineage thing that we talked about before. I mean, if we orphan these things off and treat them as little sequences, we lose the entire context of where it's happening in, and we lose the ability to kind of roll back and address problems before we hit a failure state. So I think having that developmental arc and that aspect of continuity, I think, is actually important for the go forward point, because that's part of the problem of where we're now. People are just like spinning around. A lot of it's just like blue sky ideas. Oh, wouldn't it be great if this, or this, or digging down into the weeds, where I think we got enough materials within reach that we can start actually laying some kind of a foundation here and figuring out what the basic structure of what that would entail.
So it sounds like there's two elements to that. One is consolidation, like bringing people who are already in this general nebulous area of discussion and practice together. And the other one is making sure we have a future by making sure we have a past, because some of the information is not contained in these local attempts to figure out what's going on. Some of the information is contained in the whole, particularly the whole spread over history.
And that it has to be addressed as a complete system. Again, that's going back to the system one, system two thing. We can't just have a set of check boxes. Okay, we're good. We've hit the check boxes. We passed the health and safety, whatever, and now we can proceed forward. So actually placing these within a system, and going back to the Ouroboros idea that I've mentioned before, like we, in some aspect, we have to account for everything from Paleolithic state of mind all the way up to modern hyperconsciousness and all the ranges between that. So you can't do that if you're just like, okay, I'm going to take this little piece off the shelf and we're going to go run with that.
So let's assume that what's going on in the extended liminal web is essentially the same kind of mystery school oriented people who've always been at play in different epochs. What do we need to be doing in this epoch to make that a successful function? What are the parts that the religion that is not a religion needs in order to really be an embodied force in the world?
You need aspects of ritual. So there's individual ritual for exploration. You need community ritual in the sense of being able to build shared experience. You need community ritual in the aspects of being able to engage in mentorship and lay the pattern out for the initiate to follow along on that track. You need some practices beyond that, whatever they might be, so that we can talk about the sacred gesture stuff I got into later. And you need some kind of a liturgy. So in the liturgy aspect, I think we have a lot of that within our culture extant, but it's all kind of fragmented it out there. I mean, that was one of the things I tried to do with the Shadowgate stuff, was to pull music into a liturgy. In that aspect, it either has to be like completely universally shared like the Beatles, or it can't be so wide that it's completely known when you're going into it. There has to be some kind of an exploration into a space that you're not quite familiar with. So I listen to a lot of odd music that nobody else listens to. So I've had material to draw from there. Part of that practice with the Shadowgate stuff was an attempt to a couple fold. So I'm trying to deal with neuroticism through stress inoculation, basically. A lot of the music in there is quite intense, especially the stuff that gets into the later part of the Shadowgate. I haven't run into anyone yet who's actually been able to listen to that playlist all the way through. So it's, I guess, for whatever reason, non-trivial, but at the same time, there's that emotional intensity there, but it's the YouTube playlist. You're not exactly in danger. It's a good meditative piece for that. Part of the layout of that piece is kind of taking this whole journey from recognition of space of darkness through collapse of empire, through a space of kind of reinvigoration and re-enlightenment, and then going through the crucible, and just that aspect of the ego death, and just engaging in letting that stuff just burn away.
Well, how do you think about the range of, let's say, negative experiences that we have to partially contact in order to overcome neuroticism and be in touch with what's going on? Because there's the kind of ordeal element in people's imagination is very physical in terms of primitive societies, physical pain. But there's also, the conversation that Bruce and I have been having with Vervaeke lately about grief and disappointment, particularly at the cultural level, right? How do you think about the class of the experiences that people normally don't want to touch, that prevent them from accessing initiatory and transformative ordeals?
I think a big part of that is just being able to sit into it and release. Give into it, let the experience flow through you. As long as you're fighting it, it's kind of like trying to pull something coherent back out of a mushroom state. As long as you're like fighting that, there's nothing coming back out. You have to surrender yourself into that space and go through it. And that is the only way through it, is to surrender and just let it go. I mean, that's part of the psychological aspect of the healing. That's part of the coming to terms with the ego death stuff. There's a whole bunch wrapped into that aspect of being able to be uncomfortable and surrender to that notion. I mean, it's not like you're giving up for forever, but at least being able to sit in that kind of discomfort and doing that repeatedly. It's like you're doing the same thing as in CQP, where you're doing stress inoculation. You're around live fire. You're getting all this high stimulus input that's kind of janking out your nervous system, but you're conditioning yourselves to it. Like one of the things the SAS do, when they pull a flashbang, they don't throw it and wait for a second. They throw it and they're walking right in behind it. So they're getting full force of that blast. Obviously, you did it the first time, you're probably going to be disoriented as hell. But over time, you're conditioning yourself to be able to handle that kind of stress. And it's like any other difficulty or skill. I mean, it takes repetition and practice to kind of get there. And I guess the neuroticism piece is big for me because I was neurotic as shit as a kid. Like I would literally hide under desks and stuff like that. All of my crustiness basically comes as learned response from having to deal with my environment and learn how to set hard boundaries with people.
Now, those qualities that we may need to deal with in this way, it seems like there's two approaches to that. Like one is very personal, where the individual therapy is a bit like this. And there are certain internal spiritual practices where a person is just going to encounter the negative side of whatever happens to be coming up for them.
Yeah,
the other version is for
aspect.
some ritual or structure or organization to say, whether you know it or not, here are some things you're probably resisting.
Yeah, there's a cathartic aspect where there is a space to just withdraw and encapsulate and just sift, stew, like whatever it is you need to do in isolation. But when you come out of that space, you need to kind of re-engage and keep moving with that. So going back to the harm care stuff, if someone's got that kind of disposition, whenever someone's in that difficult space, they're just gonna be, oh, it's okay, you don't have to deal with it, you don't have to deal with it. It just makes me think of that quote from Gabor Mate. I'll paraphrase. The therapeutic approach is not about making people feel good. You tell them the truth because it's the truth that will set them free. And if you're not actually telling them the truth, you're playing enabler to the worst, or not the worst necessarily, but the least best parts of their personality. You're enabling their aspects of weakness and just saying, oh, it's okay, you can keep doing that. Where there might be a moment where it's needed, where it's okay, you can keep going. Not, it's okay, withdraw. So trying to figure out that balance point, I think, is important. And that, temperamentally, that's going to be very different for different people, but we have to recognize that a broader process, you can't keep playing that, it's okay, you don't have to deal with it bullshit. Like, you need to step into it if we're going to progress.
It seems like the essential element there, whether you're giving encouragement or providing distress, is a growth model as opposed to a static model of what the individual is.
Yeah, well, back to Peterson again. If you're engaging people with this, you're trying to have that therapeutic relationship around the truth. You're trying to have a best vision of them that isn't driven by what your ego's perspective is of that, and support them to achieve that. Like, here, you're doing great. I'm recognizing quality of effort and achievement. Here, you fucked up. Here's a couple of pointers, maybe get it back on track, but it's not like, you useless fucking person, you failed or whatever. It's like, you fucked up. Here it is. Here's the pieces. Let's go and try again. Where I think a lot of stuff gets in, it just gets into the moralizing bullshit. Like, oh, you failed to do this, you're that person or whatever. It's like, again, perfection is not found on the side of the grave. It's going to take a couple of iterations, but we need to be honest about recognizing where we've gone off the track, where we failed, things we haven't accounted for in our model, all that kind of stuff. Like, really just deep honesty.
You talked a little bit about community ritual, and I'd like to get into that more, but there's an element there where, there's a similarity and difference between when I've gone off track and when we've gone off track, right? So I can work on mine, but then how does it stand when I work on ours? If I say, well, I don't have a problem with the death of God, but we do, or I'm not a slave owner, but we have a bad slave history in our culture. So at what point does the individual have to participate in leaning into the dark qualities of collective entities that they're a part of that might not really be instantiated in their individual lives? How useful is that?
The kingdom of God is within. So that is your jurisdiction. Your shit is your jurisdiction. There might be parallels with what's happening in bigger spaces, but you really need to be able to focus on your own stuff and not project out. Like, so many people, everything they look at is like, oh, that's my responsibility, or I can dictate whatever is going on in any kind of space as far as I can see, physically or through pixels. And people just kind of lose sight of, like, here's the personal boundary, here's my shit, that's what I'm responsible for. And when I'm interconnected with other people, okay, that chain of responsibility can reach out through other people and kind of build, the sense of family or sense of community. But it's got to be grounded in a clear sense of self, where those boundaries of responsibility and authority are. Like, really comprehending where those boundary conditions are, and not pushing the personal stuff out into the public, like it's a universalization of private experience or something like that. And the same thing, well, the slavery one, it's like, that's in the past. We're here and now. or the residential school. That's a good one for Canada, because we're talking about all the shit that happened to kids like 30, 50, 100 years ago. And we're in the middle of doing all kinds of shit to kids with these mask mandates and other stuff. It's like, you're worried about the past. We have shit right here, right now, that we're fucking up pretty bad. And we need to be attentive to that, not distracting ourselves with whatever could happen in the future, or the pains of the past that we just can't seem to let go of. As long as we keep doing those things, we're never going to actually address the problems that are right here now in front of us.
Right. So there's a risk of evading the ritual and growth potential in the moment by associating it with histories and futures and collectives.
You're distracting from that experience, I think, because again, it's back to the jurisdiction thing. You've got no control. You can't fucking change it. The only thing you can change is how you're interacting with the world now, what you're doing now, what you're putting your energy into now. And if you see patterns in the broader society that you're not agreeing with, don't comply. Don't go on. Live your philosophy. Actually embody the ideals that you're talking about. And that's, having integrity is the biggest act of revolution in a corrupt society. So if we can maintain that aspect of personal integrity and accountability, then we have some building blocks to go on. And if you've got a community of people who have that basis, then there's some kind of there's the capacity to build a structure out of that, where otherwise there really isn't.
Well, I have a curiosity here around something like symbolic support for the people of Ukraine. My neighborhood's full of these things. And on the one hand, like when you look at it from a mystery school tradition, there's this element of stay on your own mat, deal with things that are in your jurisdiction. You actually, if you have no influence levers over Ukraine and you're filling your time and your mind with that, you're not even helping the situation, and you are absconding from your ability to show up with integrity in the areas where you do have some control. But on the other hand, the mystery schools have often been associated with the idea that we do have subtle dimensions of influence on the world, and that by our symbolic gestures, we may be able to contribute to outcomes and pattern shifts going forward.
Yeah, I mean, if you want to engage in that space, posting a flag is just pure fucking virtue signaling. And if it's the only time you come to any salience about the Ukrainian conflict, it's a long fucking background there. There's a lot of shit going on both ways. There are no innocent parties beyond the civilians in that context. Like all the shit that's gone down between the US, the Ukraine, and Russia and the Ukraine, the proxy war stuff, it's just a complete shit show from top to bottom. And that's like leaving out Biden and his corruption and whatever else is going on in that layer as well. If you want to contribute something, then I think actually giving money to humanitarian aid, or I've seen guys in the US military, they're heading over to train people. If you feel so passionately about it, then, time, effort, blood and gold, put some of that towards it. Otherwise, it's just fucking moral masturbation stuff. Like you're not actually engaged. You're just doing some virtue signaling. Talking about the broader context of how all this shit came down, the pressure, like just look at the map. That's Sebastopol is the only southern seaport Russia has. They're not giving that up for anything. You might as well just, like it's a no-go. Look back in 2014. They came in, they took Sebastopol. Did they really care about the oil fields? Not so much. So that southern seaport, especially when that's the only one you've got, and then your only other two ports are those, that protectorate and then north of Latvia, that's an exposed position. And the US has got bases all the way around there, and they've been carrying on with all kinds of financial fuckery in Ukraine for the last 10 years. McCain was back in there in like 2014 before Biden was. But yeah, there's been all kinds of bullshit going on, and believing the media story about suddenly, we got to go to war. Like there's some context here. If we want to do something real about this, we need to, like, again, like anything else, complexity model, step back, have a broader comprehension of what the fuck is actually going on here in the broader geopolitical space. Putin's got his whole fucked up trip about empirism or whatever else, but we need to hold our own leaders for account in how we're kind of engaging with this stuff. but there's so little transparency in the system, and there's so much distraction that I don't think people have any real grasp of what's going on.
Do you think that's just an insufficiency? Like, is it just an insufficiency of our understanding of how systems work? Or is there an effective system at play that is incentivized to get people to think that symbolism, virtual signaling, public expression of their values and identity, that's the appropriate arena for their engagement, because that's an arena which doesn't actually interfere with the political, economic, bureaucratic, whatever system is set up that we're embedded in? Is there a kind of intentionality to that, or is it merely a lack of understanding? Yeah.
Well, there's both. At the base level, there's a lack of understanding. That lack of understanding has been engendered over decades, especially through aspects of the social justice movement. That also brings up all the hair harm dynamics that trigger people really easily and get them sucked in. And as soon as that happens, they're kind of disconnected. So I think as meat bags, that's a difficult issue for us in the first place to overcome. But then we clearly have people who are trying to antagonize that for whatever it means, whether it's Schwab and the WF, or they're clearly bad actors, because the stories that we're being told are completely inconsistent with the reality on the ground. And that seems to be across like pretty much every domain now. I mean, foreign policy stuff has always been like that. Go back to the CIA's role with Arbenz in Guatemala, or Mossadegh in Iran. There's been all kinds of fuckery happening at the international stage, manipulating geopolitics, proxy wars, all this stuff. Step a little bit later into Vietnam, and then you've got the psychological programs like Phoenix happening. And sort of roll back a sec for the social justice movement stuff, like Gloria Steinem was a CIA agent from 1958 till 1962. There's about a 3-minute clip you can find on YouTube where she describes the CIA as the kind of liberal activists who epitomized the Kennedy administration. I'm like, that's interesting in modern context, because they're certainly activists now. Like, we got the Two Moms ad and all this other stuff. Things about Little Red Book in the higher end of the U.S. intelligence service. He's had fans that's there since like the 1950s. So if you go back and look through some of Richard Prouty's stuff, he's talking about guys who are in the chain of command, high up in the chain of command of the U.S. Intelligence and military service. We're all over Mao's Little Red Book. I mean, the CIA was happy to pretend to be commies like all over the place, whether it was stuff like Operation Gladio in Italy and Spain, or you've got the same kind of stuff going on in South America.
How do you view because there's a sense a lot of people have of the interpenetration of intelligence services and occult societies, right? So some of that obviously is not going to be what you mean by a mystery school, but how do you think about the occult intelligence interpenetration over history?
I don't know that there's been that much. I haven't seen much evidence. And like through the period where the Russians were doing all the research into mind manipulation, and then you have MK Ultra on this side of the pond, or you go back even earlier to the Nazis in World War II. I think the level of knowledge was not there, that they were just kind of hoovering up anything they could find,
right?
Rather than actually deeply engaging in any kind of capacity. So they were just like, okay, here's a magic bullet, here's a magic bullet, here's a magic bullet. We'll take these and go try to operationalize them in some capacity, but without actually ever engaging in the deeper context.
So there's a similarity there to the critique you're making of the liminal web community, or whatever it is today, right? Which is there's a lot of people and a lot of pieces in play, but the organic whole that would really make it powerful in the world seems to be missing or underrepresented.
Yeah, I think so. It comes back to, you have to systematize it in some way that system has coherence and integrity. Otherwise, the model is just going to fail. Part of the pieces I've looked at in terms of deconstructing this is, what's the relationship with the numinous? So if people are going to opine about their relationship with Ayin Self-Air, that's just that's beyond what we're able to touch. Like, okay, maybe you went down your little personal fantasy rabbit hole, but how's it applying to everyday life right here and now? So trying to go through a reconceptualization of not what God is, but what is our relationship to divinity. So if you take the Tetragrammaton or Jod-He-Vah-He and you write that vertically, that's an anthropomorphic figure. It's a line out of the Bible. We've come in his name. I mean, there's an analog, there's a humorous aspect of Hebrew language in there, but it's like, sorry, that's many different things at once. I think I've got a piece here that might actually, this is out of Sepher Ehben. If you don't mind, I'll actually just read that.
Yeah, please do.
So they're trying to reformulate from scratch. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with the Logos, and the Word was the Logos, the generative construct which impregnates the material with potential. Hashem, the ineffable name of that which was, that which is, that which shall be, the cryptic gatekeeper of nothingness, limitless nothingness, limitless light, which has become enfolded and transubstantiated into the corporeal, binding layers of number, letter, and sound in rational dimension, mediated and interlaced through orders of magnitude, through patterns of irrational proportion. Hashem, the glyph and construct of the Logos, the focus of will in alignment with the most elevated, through a coherent frame of reference of action, bound to a coherent frame of reference of destination, aligned with a tempered strand of thought, from the alpha of the past to the omega of our future. Our self-authorship is written with its image, Hashem, because giving the name of one's own relationship to the numinous for another to use is a profanity of the necessarily personal journey of implementing your own concrete instantiation of the base abstract of the Logos, defining its interface through your inner cartography to generate the maps of meaning of your own existence. So binding to that, I want to pair another concept. So in Freemasonry, we talked about before, we use the term the volume of sacred law, or other people would use the term the Bible. Whenever people talk about sacred books, they're always talking about paper. But divinity is only ever written in 4 letters, and it prints out like this, like these meat bags. So if we're going to have from there, we'd look at the aspect of distress and eustress. If eustress is you're engaging in these kind of activities that we're talking about, like pushing yourself, building yourself, distress is degrading that whole thing. I think if we take the paper thing away and start looking at ourselves as volumes of instantiation of the sacred law, I think there's a way of kind of decoupling the religious fundamentalism, figuring out how we're able to arrange and orchestrate this relationship with the numinous through the intermediary of the tetragrammaton, which is the anthropomorphized inflection point where we go from the material world, inflect through that into the numinous and up from there. So understanding that up in there, let's just set that shit aside because we're humans. It's not really that relevant to our life. We're not there yet. But that point up into the point of inflection where we are trying to embody the Logos, I think that's a concrete way of instantiating that relationship where we can kind of protect it from some of the bullshit that comes in with it. And the same thing with the volume of sacred law, is like looking at corporeal life as the volume of sacred law. What kind of distress are we causing and creating for that? I think that's a way of shifting the whole conceptualization of that off a little bit, not completely. So it's not unrelatable to people who have a basis in old terms religious experience. And it's not completely unrelatable to people who are kind of into the atheist movement. It's trying to figure out, here's a coherent structure of how these things actually interrelate. And it doesn't require old school religious faith, but it gives you a conceptual pattern of how to mediate and frame that relationship in a way that's hopefully functional. I mean, that's still got to be pen tested, but that's where I'm kind of going with that stuff.
So the notion is of a coherent bridging concept of some kind, which is trans-religious, which is, I guess, another way to say esoteric. But there's some other bridging that's possible here too, it seems like. And to me, it's reflected in ambiguities in how people experience words like logos and law, right? So there's a sense in which law might be associated with one particular phase of history and social control and communication media. There's a sense in which logos, like in the McGilchrist sense, is a left brain version that we might have to, shift away from in order to have a more right brain culture, a post-scriptural, post-written culture of some kind, where we have to think more in terms of felt resonances and wholes, and where the idea of the thing that cannot be named becomes much more present, even to the point where people are suspicious of logos, suspicious of law, suspicious of even a mythically generalized notion of the volume of the law. How do you relate to that notion of the limiting quality of logos and law? Right? Is it just about getting the balance right, or is there a misunderstanding, or is there something dangerous and contracted about the notion?
I'm kind of thinking back to why using the Hebrew term Hashem, which is common within, you don't ever say the name of God, you use Hashem, which is the name, literally. That's what it means. And I think in that sense, if you're trying to define your relationship with the numinous, you don't have the credibility or whatever else to be able to define that relationship for anyone else. So your name of your God is private in that kind of context. I think that's a way of bridging that. And I'm sorry, I drifted off from the core point that you're trying to dig into there.
I'm drifting off from it as well, because another thing occurred to me, which is, I like how you just said that, right? Though that phrasing it in this way can make it very personal, and it mediates between the spoken and the unspoken. And I'm wondering about social organizations, right? If we can have, if Hashem names the name that we don't name, to what degree could we instantiate social organizations where we don't necessarily articulate what we're doing, right? We go, well, we relate to a great name, or we have a cause, but do we even tell ourselves what that cause is? Like, I'm wondering about the, I'm rambling here now, but there's an element of the
so
occult,
I think that is specifically for that nexus point of that in the individuated relationship with the numinous. Mm-hmm. When it comes to interacting and organizing with each other, we kind of need to have an architecture in place that we can see, we can all see, we can introspect on, and we can all kind of understand and have our feedback in. So that in some aspects, it needs to be exoteric, it needs to be explicit and codified to some degree. And then coming back to touching on something you mentioned before, it needs to be a distinction between doctrine and dogma. So dogma is dead, ossified, it's not modifiable. Doctrine is a living document. Even if it's slow to change, something like military doctrine over the years, or even Catholic Church doctrine on gay marriage or whatever. If it's doctrine, it still has the capacity, it's solidified, but it has the capacity to be upgraded and changed. But you don't enter into that process of modification unless you've got a clear analytical case of why this has to happen. Here's why. We're not just throwing things in willy-nilly. It's not immutable. It's not that it can't be challenged, but if you do want to challenge it, you better make sure you have your fucking ducks in a row.
So in the zone of the individual, you've got this personal connection to the inexpressible, and you've got this process of going through managed exposure to negative intensities. And then in the zone of the interpersonal, you've got the establishment of doctrine, which is clear enough that people can challenge it in some rigorous integrity-based way, and so that it is fluid and evolves over time, but it doesn't change too easily.
The Freemasonry uses the term landmarks and that kind of thing, where here are some immutable pieces, and then here's a layer of associating those immutable pieces. These won't change, like the foundational pieces, but the pieces above that, how the relationship, they are amenable to change, but it's not like, okay, we're going to swap this up every week, where that has to be like, again, you can challenge it, but you better make sure you have your ducks in a row in terms of, why am I challenging it? Is it worth the effort of doing all this stuff? Or am I just blue skying and I have a good idea, fairies come and landed on my back and whispered in my ear?
How do you think about the the ratio between ritual and inner practice, right? So if we're talking about, say, meditation or something like that, we might say, well, you should be doing it daily or twice daily or something like that. When we think about ritual, is it daily? Is it seasonal? Is it like how often do we think about these things? Could ritual entirely replace daily inner practice, or do they supplement each other? Does one happen every, is it
I think
millimeters and centimeters?
Some of it's ad hoc. Having a daily practice is always a good idea, because that's always going to anchor you, through your daily experience. In terms of local group, small community types of meetings, once a month is a pretty good pattern, or once every 2 weeks. Something that's scheduled and regular enough that, okay, I know when it's coming up. I don't have to hold in my back of my head, it's going to be this day or that day or whatever. It's like, it's the third Tuesday of the month and I'm going. So we know third Tuesday of the month, whatever the calendar dates or whatever else is doing, that's when we go to ritual. That's when we engage at this smaller level. And I think at the broader social or wider social scale, more collective rituals around stuff like the cross-border dates or seasonal stuff, like spring and fall equinox are kind of ideal times, have traditionally been used in mystery schools for initiation dates or broader ritual. So that could be something as simple as like, it's just a rave with a bit of a ritual introduction. So we've got the basis of the structure there, and then it's just a bit of ecstasis and catharsis for a bit. Whereas I think at the more local level, you need the tangible things these are tangible exercises. We're doing things that actually have some meaning besides the maintenance of bringing people in, initiating them, giving them tools, and then trying to help mentor them along from there as well. So I kind of see 3 stages out in that, where simple home practice, individual practice, it could be as basic as every time I take a shower, I'm going to treat that as a mikvah. I'm going to do a little prayer as I stand under the water or whatever. It doesn't have to be super complicated. Like, I'm not going to do 10,000 sutras before breakfast or whatever. But again, there's a range in there for people to adapt that to what's working for them, what's working for the temperament. That's a bit of a space to go and explore that and pull it apart and to find out what really is working. It's like, okay, let's throw this at the walls a couple of times. And then you got to figure out, okay, is this just not working for me, or am I not quite applying the right effort in the right spots, or trying to figure out where that kind of a balance is. So there's rooms for some exploration there. The local group thing should be fairly structured. And then when you flip back out again to the higher order stuff, then more open, more ecstatic type ritual experiences, I think, make sense. Like kind of like the seasonal gathering things, like everybody's coming back from the hunting grounds. Okay, we're going to get back together, have a big feast and party, and reinvigorate the community, reinvigorate the social connection from people who are more extant and distant, and try to get all that kind of up and spooling up again, recreate the coherence at individual level, and then local community level and broader community level.
What counts as the community in the way you're describing it? Like, for example, if you're in a city, you go, is my community the network of people who are tuned into these kinds of things with me, or is it all the people who live in my town? What scale am I thinking of the rituals on?
In the past, it would have been all the people who live in my town. I think now it's much more about the intentional community of who you choose to gather with. But at the same time, it's like the lower local level, maybe I can do something at my block level. Yeah. Maybe not the town or the county, but maybe there's enough people within my local neighborhood that we can at least do something simple, like, hey, we're just going to get together and have something equivalent to like a Shabbat dinner, once every 3 months.
So let's say I'm John Vervaeke, I'm living in Toronto, and I've got this religion that is not a religion idea. If I have monthly group circling practice, What's missing from that in terms of really instantiating a mystery ritual? Is that adequate, or does it need to be more explicitly tied into cosmic and biospheric patterns, say?
I think circling is like one of the things that you put into the basket. So as that, you're setting a pattern for the dialogos in engagement, but there's much less of the ritual aspect in there. Whereas the stuff I was trying to lay out with the Havura, where you're looking at the abstraction, classification, and proper application of hypothetical or modeling, setting a problem domain and having 3 or more participants, and each one of those participants have to sit and embody each of those stages around it. And until all 3 people have gone through all 3 stages. So that's a way of kind of bringing them in, addressing those specific psychotechnologies, which I've mentioned before, kind of the bridge between the pre-modern and the modern brain in terms of consciousness and cognitive patterns. Trying to make that explicit, but not like club you over the head kind of explicit, and getting people to embody that in a practical form and having them switch it up. It's like, no, you can't just go to your favorite spot on the bench and you play that role all the time. Everybody has to move around and do each of those things. The other part of that conceptualizing of that ritual is trying to get people engaged or hooked into their local landscape in some capacity. Like if you've got a little bit of green space, or you can find a back corner of the park where people don't often go, set up this little ritual space. I think the disconnect from our local landscape really sets us adrift in a lot of ways. Like people, especially in cities, like they don't know what stars look like anymore. They have no idea of sense of seasons, even when the sun's changing all that much. Any way that we can reintegrate ourselves into the local biosphere in like real practical sense, whether that's engagement with, building sacred stone sites or gardening or whatever, just something that's hands-on, even if it's not daily, just having that touch point of getting back into there. You're maintaining that connection with the physical real world and consequences. And you're also hooking back into the biosphere, the life rhythms. That's
you said you used the phrase "set the problem space." What are you thinking when you use that phrase?
You're looking at an idea to explore or decompose. Okay. So say we could do this. So my contention of let's stop using a religion that is not a religion. Let's just use the term mystery tradition. So we could set that as a problem domain to explore. We would put that basically in the middle of the circle. And then if there's 3 of us sitting around, we each have to pull back, look at those 3 different perspective types, try to embody an argument that is coherent with that perspective type, and then go around the circle until each person has had each of those spaces, and then we try to pull it back together into a whole. So it's a balancing thing. Like I was talking about the contentious relationships where it's not driven by ego. Basically trying to engender something like that, where we are contending over what this meaning is, but because we're all working coherently, not for me to win, but for us to find the best understanding and comprehension of this, that's a way of kind of rolling along everybody and powering them up by getting them into a space that where they're actually embodying those thinking skills in the same kind of way that within Masonic ritual we take candidates through a narrative so they understand a certain perspective, and then we give them a set of working tools that augments the lesson that happened in the narrative part.
That's interesting. It sounds to me like it's the collective enactment of a process that's analogous to individual pondering.
Yes. Yeah, that's a really good way of distilling it down. We're trying to, I think the ritual aspect of that gives importance to the fact that this is an important thing. This is worth attention. This is worth a devotion of energy towards it. And that embeds it into kind of the basis of what the structure of the mystery tradition is. It's like, this is one of our foundation stones. It's like, this is why, because when you do these things, it takes you from here and can bring you up capacity-wise, intelligence-wise, whatever else. Like, we're trying to level people up, bring them more towards adulthood, bring whatever it is of themselves kind of up and into the light and into being, and trying to facilitate that process rather than enabling, oh, it's okay, you go take a time out, it'll be all right.
Let's talk a little bit about the ritual at the layer beyond the local, but also below the local at, like, say, the family level, because that's where a lot of people do their whatever approximation of ritual they're doing, right? They're doing Easter, they're doing Christmas, they're doing Thanksgiving. Yeah. They have these seasonal markers. They are gathering together. What would you say is generally insufficient about the way people do their sacred family rituals?
I think in large degree it's just the lack of intentionality. A lot of it's carried out just through habituation. Like, oh, we got to pack up and drive here and go do this and go do this. Where I think if you're a little bit religious, and even if you're just like saying prayer whenever you sit down, or that is the only time you say prayer when you get together, that's a way of making that gathering a bit more distinct than just, oh, we're going to sit down, I have to listen to my noisy uncle and my cranky aunt, or the crying cousins, or whatever else. Sacralizing in some aspect. So whether it's the aspect of giving something up to make it sacred, or like you can do that in this meal thing if you're doing potluck. If everybody's actually genuinely contributing something to that, you're giving something up to that process, which would be a lot better than, okay, we're going to go to grandma's and she's going to cook dinner for everybody again, like she does every year, and everybody's just going to sit in the living room while she slaves away, or her and the two aunts slave away, or whatever else. I don't have the reference for it off the top of my head, but there's some good literature about meal prep together and how that binds people really, really well. So I think that's another aspect of it. Instead of potlucking, bring it at home, we're going to go and we're going to actually create this meal together. So maybe we start off a little prayer, we do some cooking, and I don't mean it has to be explicit. It's just an expression of intent and intentionality about why we're here, what we're doing, some aspect of gratitude, giving thanks. Like, at the psychological basis, those pieces have to be there for in order for it to operate effectively, I think. And then you're just trying to get some of that into the more mundane reactions. And if they're on a consistent periodical basis, then that becomes much easier to kind of flow along with and follow. And then it gives you the anchor point of like, oh yeah, we got to go listen to Aunt Mary again, but hey, every time we do this ritual, she gets a little bit better, and we all have fun, or we're able to have a laugh over it. And just finding ways to kind of shift the shittier family dynamics and bringing them into a more positive space. But all of it's just about opportunities to kind of level people up. It's like, here, I've tripped and fallen, like, that's good. Back up on your feet. What do you need to kind of keep rolling? You need some catharsis. You got to put a couple of emotional band-aids on here for a day or two before you kind of pick up and roll along again, but just figuring out more social structures where we engender and support that kind of interaction in some capacity.
There's a whole range of ways to do that. And within that range, it seems like there's a bit of a tension historically for people between, let's say, conformity and idiosyncrasy in what comes together. Right. I think one of the ways that people have socially tried to reinvigorate the sacred dimension of ritual at these scales when they felt it slipping is to enforce more conformity. We're all going to wear this, or we're all going to do it like this. And there's a formal performative level of conformity. But then at the same time, there's always this kind of shadow element to this underside where cousin Hank gets drunk and wants to get mad about something that's happened in family history, right? And in a way, although that's often handled in an incoherent fashion, people are trying to bring something in that's personally meaningful to them. And it might be pain, or it might be they show up in a weird costume, or right. Yeah. So that on the one side, there's this, what can you bring that is important to you energetically, whether you understand it or not? And how do we weave that together versus let's really streamline this and make it more formal?
If we had the streamlined the regular gathering structure kind of set up, and Uncle Hank comes in with a bee in his bonnet. It's like, all right, bud, time for the Havura. We're gonna sit down, because he's been hitting this thing like over and over and over again. It's about time we actually sat down, decomposed, and figure out what the fuck is going on. And probably part of the reason Hank's getting frustrated is because everybody's just tuning out and won't actually fucking listen. It's like, oh, he's too intense, I can't handle that, so we'll just dismiss it like it doesn't matter. And I think that's a pattern I see really consistently almost across the board. It's like, oh, it's a little too intense for me, so we'll just pretend it didn't fucking happen. And it doesn't even have to be that emotionally intense. Like sometimes it's just intellectual. If you charge or call somebody on something. I'm just thinking of a couple of specific circumstances. Like the first time this happened to me of note was back in uni. We went to see Stephen Jay Gould do a thing at the Royal Ontario Museum. And I got up and asked him, this is right after James Gleick, Chaos Making a New Science came out. I'm like, okay, these patterning things, these seem to make a lot more sense about evolution as opposed to some fucking teleological thing. Whether you look at random mutation or whether you look at selection mutation, either of those are going to produce fractal type patterns in terms of how they instantiate. I was trying to articulate this to him, and it was just like, no, it's evolution has a goal and it's moving that way. Like, okay, it's like I see there's different aspects there. It's like, so here's the authority figure who doesn't want to be challenged. Here's also someone who's like rigidly attached to their own ideas and not really, and they're trying to protect the ego rather than delve into maintain the credibility of the model. Ran same thing with a climate scientist a couple of weeks ago on Twitter. I was laughing about the CO2 model, and the guy's like, okay, Layman, you put together your arguments, and I'll come back and rip you apart. So I went and 2-minute search to find an article on how changes in the ionosphere and ionization up there affect the way CO2 interacts. Posted it back to him. Guy didn't fucking respond. Like, okay, dude, I'm waiting. We've got potential for a conversation here. Waited 24 hours, still didn't have a response. I'm like, okay, Mr. Orthodox, what happened? Did you go back to fucking high school science and figure out that chemistry is based off charge? We're doing root cause analysis here. If your model is based off a component and that component is affected by other things, you obviously haven't reached the fucking root of the analysis. I mean, that comes back to the good faith thing. It's like, sorry, you've made a structural error. I don't care about what your conclusions are, but the structural basis of what you're talking about is fucking broken. So let's just cut the bullshit and actually dig deeper into the problem and figure out what is actually going on. And there's so much of this, it's the combination of the magic bullet here. We've got a simple little answer, and we're just going to dismiss anything that, takes any amount of effort to intellectually or emotionally or whatever to actually engage and try to deal with. So there's a lot of fear and avoidance stuff in there. And that ties into the same thing with so many people on the left. It's like any word that isn't harmonious with what they want, it's just like they shut you off, block your account, or mute you. It's like, really? Really, you're so fucking fragile that if anybody says anything different, you just have to wall them off and pretend they don't fucking exist. That kind of stuff I just find completely fucking toxic. And
that's the exact opposite of what you're imagining ritual trains us to be capable of doing. Yes,
completely inverted of what we're capable of as human beings, and it just completely fucking degrades us.
When we think of ritual at scales beyond the local, it gets a little bit fuzzy about how real that can be for us, and whether that's like, national rituals or rituals as members of a planet, or it's something like, this concerns me a lot. How do we inhabit our time period? Because some of those things you were talking about, getting into niches in the environment as ritual spaces, a lot of that puts the human being in sync with not only larger cycles, but the reality of the system they exist in at the moment, right? You touch it, you see it, you take it in through your senses, you're embedded in it. So you're inhabiting your local space more completely. But then we say, well, how do you inhabit the 21st century more completely? How do you inhabit the information environment more completely, right? Are those scales at which it's feasible to do ritual in the same way, or is that sort of just out of the purview?
I think it's possible. So let me draw an analogy here. So dry fire training in firearms. You're either using something that resets a trigger, or you're using something like an airsoft gun. You're doing repetitions of the basic fundamentals that you need in order to exercise the skill effectively. But it's not enough. You need to do that dry fire exercise. Then you go to the range, you do live fire, and you make sure these two things are actually talking coherently with each other. So I see that as kind of like an analog process. So online, yeah, you can do dry fire ritual. Like you can at least make the contacts, get some kind of a basis there. But at some point, there has to be an anchor in meat space. Like for years, like the first 15 years of the internet, I didn't have any contacts who hadn't met in life first, or very few contacts that I'd met online that I didn't actually meet in meat space later, because they felt, for whatever reason, felt they needed to do that kind of a connection to it. When I first moved back to Ontario in 2004, we had a gaming clan for America's Army and Canadian Honor Guards. We had a get together in the summer, and there were people from 10 provinces all come together who just like games online. They all come together for a weekend, so we'd actually meet each other, have some kind of embodied experience together. You know, cook on the barbecue, and play some paintball together, and do all this other kind of stuff. But the virtual communities must have like some kind of real physical touch point. Even if it's not the community, members of that community, I think, have to get together and have the meat space experience where it's complete embodied and not, we're not just sitting looking at a screen together. We can go for a walk down the stream. We can go for a walk through the bush, you know, dig for chanterelles, pick leeks, like more integrated pieces, plus the whole aspect of body language and actually just being able to communicate with people when you see them directly. I think they kind of have to be paired. It's not that the online experience is invalid, but it does need to be coupled with something relevant to meat space.
You mentioned earlier the kind of convergence around a liturgy you think is essential in order to be able to do the mystery school thing properly. What were you thinking of when you think of a liturgy?
I'm thinking of music and movies to a large degree. Music more so.
Shared cultural artifacts of some kind.
Shared cultural artifacts that are effectively written in archetypal language that give us the basis for both the shared experience and kind of pulling things apart and looking under the hood. Like some songs are really exceptional, dude. Either in just generating the emotive experience or kind of taking you down a memory path where there has to be a link the journey, I think, in some aspect. But yeah, sorry. Got lost in the weeds with that one. Coming back to that, I think at the structural level, I don't think we can do like one size fits all anymore. Like that worked with smaller populations based off of, I would take something like the Hidden Tribes report, who those groups are, that doesn't really matter to me that much. Using that data to figure out what psychological mechanisms are behind those bifurcations, that's where I think there's a real pattern. So I think I've talked about this before, where we got this long history of like handing out really fucking simple platitudes to people and expecting it's actually going to help, where depending where you are on the temperament scale, if you're telling people to, you know, be kind or whatever, if I'm highly agreeable already, well, that advice is probably going to push me into a lot of fucking dysfunctional relationships, because I'm going to give up territory where I should be fucking more attentive just because, oh, well, got to do that to get along. Whereas someone who's really disagreeable probably needs to sit with that message for a while and really figure that shit out. So I think it's a matter of tracking out where these kind of decision and nexus points are, and then branching them out so that we can account for some aspect in what different temperamental profiles need to learn from within that space, and kind of creating a topology of that. I was thinking about, you've got the tree of life coming up from root to leaf, and then you've got the tree of knowledge, which is coming from leaf back down to root. So it's having those two kind of integrated. You've got the natural world and its extrapolation from lower order up into complexity, and then you need to kind of chase that back down. And the more integrated we can have those two trees together, it's the world and our model of the world, then it only goes up from there. Like, the more coherent the model is, the better decisions you can make, the more accurate your interventions are going to be. Yeah, I think that's kind of the one of the more underlying principles I'm trying to lay out with that. Is like, we need this, just engaging the scientific method. We need to have, the map will never be the territory, but the more coherent the map is with the territory, the more effective the map is.
How big a role in your thinking is played by this psychological model of the big traits?
The big five?
Yeah.
That's really at the basis of it. We finally have a model. So let me go back. From Brett Weinstein's statement, all true narratives reconcile. I think we've been trying to generate these models over time to greater or lesser effect. So when I look at Nietzsche and his whole thing about aesthetics, I see him trying to model temperament. If we go back to the pentagram and, you know, four traditional elements plus spirit, I see that also as another attempt of trying to model this stuff out. So as we've gone along through time, we've generated models that are doing this process of being more coherent, being more consistent with the map to the world, having the map match the territory. And with the big five stuff, it's like, there's a lot of psychometric data behind it. At the basis of what's happening behind that, we've got an association between behavioral and neurotransmitter and mechanism. So I think of anything else we've come up with so far, I don't think it's complete, but holy shit, I think we're on the right track finally. It's a lot better than like Myers-Briggs or something like that, where, you know, I liked it. I'm an INTP, ISTP, sitting right on the border there, but it's not, the mechanisms are intuitive ones that are not actually necessarily grounded in the reality, where the big five stuff is grounded in psychometric reality. It also has a basis on terms of human physiology underneath that. That's a much more coherent model. And in terms of mapping out that tree and the temperament stuff, that's exactly what I'm talking about. Is looking at the 5 dimensions and then the 2 subdimensions of each, figuring out where failure points are on those, failure boundary conditions, and trying to map that out as teachable space, mappable and teachable space, and reintegrating that. So we come up with these simple little truisms or whatever. It's like, okay, put that into a space and then break that down and decompose it from what it looks like from all these different perspectives. Is it saying the same thing to everybody? If it's not, then there needs to be some permutations that explain why, if you're coming from here, it looks like this. If you're coming from this side, it looks like this, kind of like the 5 blind guys in the elephant. We need to pull that knowledge out and actually model it so it's relevant for the kind of range of human experience, instead of the stupid fucking assumption that one size is going to fit all the time.
You sent me a link to a conversation between Jonathan Pageau and Brett Weinstein. What was it that you found interesting about that discussion?
I think part of it was just frustration. To be blunt, everybody who's come out of the Santa Fe Institute, Brett, who's the biologist, he's the one guy who I see is like really fucking understands systems prototyping in a more hands-on. I've worked on this stuff, then I've just twiddled the dials on somebody else's machine. I don't think he's had any programming experience or other stuff like that, but he at a fundamental level really seems to understand that kind of system stuff. And his conversation with Pageau, I think there were parallels between Peterson and Harris, the first conversation. Like, I'm just watching Pageau going, fuck, dude, really? Come on. Like, you're this far away. Just catch up. And I've had a few challenges with him before. It's like, dude, if you're such a master of symbolism and all this other stuff, like, why did you give Freemasonry the fucking chick comics treatment? Which it was totally like, I don't know, do you remember the little religious comics that came out before? They were like a 3-panel.
Vaguely.
They were like these religious fundamentalist, CHICK chick comics that you'll be able to see some of them online. You're probably able to find some of the crazy Freemasonic ones, but it was this a little comic that they handed out. I can't remember whether it's from Jehovah's Witnesses or one of the other ones, or whether it was an independent, but it was basically religious fundamentalist comics trying to tell everybody how if you play D&D, you're going to hell or whatever kind of nonsense like that. Like, it was a comic set that was basically really religious fundamentalist and trying to engage Pageau about Freemasonry. It was just like, all right off into the conspiracy shit. I'm like, fuck, seriously, dude? There's a bit of a wealth of material here. Like, you really have to go right for the fucking conspiracy stuff that really undermines your credibility in my eyes to a massive degree. Sorry, but it's just, that's what it is.
There's a blurriness there, I think, for a lot of people who like to see the abstract pattern level of religion, right? Where, when are we talking about stereotypes and when are we talking about archetypes, right? When am I talking about these underlying patterns and when am I talking about cartoonish, oversimplified representations of things that are laden with all kinds of bias and distortion? How do you see
we're back
that?
to the simple, stupid, simple, elegant, raster versus vector, check boxes versus pattern. Again, it's that, where does it make that transition? When it becomes kind of reductionist, when it's not trying to be an embodiment of the knowledge, but just becomes a reductionist dismissal of it. So at that point, you kind of shit the bed. Actually, when I went to see Peterson in Toronto, I took my 2 sons. We paid for the VIP tickets and stuff like that. And I'm like, all right, got my chance to ask, like, what do you think about Freemasonry and other mystery traditions? Because a lot of stuff that you're talking on, I'm seeing like sometimes literally phrasing that comes out of Masonic ritual. And it was just like, sorry, don't know anything about it. I'm like, fuck, again? That was kind of disappointing, but I don't know if this relationship with Pageau has anything to do with that kind of general, yeah, we're not so cool with that, but it would be good. There's a number of people I'd like to just like, here's some material, like dig into this stuff. I think you'll find some value in there. Maybe not, but at least look at it first and be able to make an informed decision on that.
Yeah, there's still a really big divide between the people who are most prominently thinking about this stuff and the practicing lineages of people who have been thinking about and working with this stuff for a long time. That fascinates me. When it comes to Pageau, he sounds like an excited little kid when you listen to him. Mm-hmm. He sounds very open and very enthusiastic. Yeah. But it's hard for me to figure out what he's actually proposing other than reading slightly differently.
Yeah, I get the same sense where it was when Brett talks about something, the things in those directions, he's very consistent and coherent. So he's consistent over multiple times of talking about the thing, and his models, the way he lays things out, are very, very coherent. So when I see Pageau not following along, I'm like, what's the matter, dude? He's like, laid this out pretty fucking concise, no embellishment, and it's a tight little package. So I kind of wondered, like, where did you fall off the rails trying to follow the thread here?
It's an interesting example because, the basic setup of where Pageau is coming from is always pretty good because he leans into this, depth esoteric reading of religious texts. And I think, in many ways, the esoteric criticism of exoteric religion is that it was never a set of substandard pre-scientific claims about what the world consists of physically and where it came from. It was always this other phenomenon, so that there may be a problem with religion in the world, but that problem is not the inadequacy of the explanations, it's the social and superficial capture of that material. And then that's an error that's repeated by the atheist critics of religion as well. So Pageau seems to come in with that frame, and I appreciate that. But where does it go from there? How does it not cross that gap? Because you were talking about coherence when we were talking about the big 5 traits, almost as if it's a feature of the number of different domains that can co-validate the same pattern. And so there's a gap there in that conversation for me between Pageau and Weinstein about how close Pageau can get to the biological element of the patterning, right? And so the lack of coherence is that it can't quite cross that gap to manifest the patterns from another domain of study. Although he tries, but there's still a sense of that gap there.
Yeah, and I got the same thing when Peterson was talking to Harris for the first go around. Like, thought Jordan was pretty clear in the way he's laying stuff out, and then it just feels like Sam's trying, but just like not getting up to that ledge where he actually gets the vista to see and put all the pieces together.
Speaking of Peterson, I talked to Wei Tsang recently, and he's follows Harris and Peterson and Weinstein pretty closely, and in his view, they're all confessing the need for a psychedelic renaissance of mystery schools informed by science. And so I'm curious what you think the role of psychedelics might be in that, right? Obviously, they can be, appears like some of them are really good for treatments of traumas and depression.
Yeah.
If they're imprinting tools, then they might allow us to get up to speed on the world we exist in faster. For a lot of people, it's a quick road to mystical experience that doesn't take as much training and time. But it's debatable the exact significance of the role they played in the history of the mystery schools or in the mystery schools going forward.
I don't know if the role is that debatable, especially if you get further back into the traditions. So there's even a hint of that within Freemasonry itself. Any of the stuff around the death of Hiram Abiff, the plant acacia plays a big role in the whole death of Hiram Abiff story. The story is told a couple of different ways. I guess the core one is some craftsmen are sent out to find him because he's disappeared after being killed by these ruffians, which the craftsmen don't know about. They sit down to rest somewhere, and one of the craftsmen tries to pull himself up by a sprig of acacia, and it comes loose in his hand. So that's an indication that the soil has been disturbed underneath. They dig, they find the grave. So there is a thesis that Moses' vision was based off of DMT, probably sourced from acacia. And there are plant sources of monoamine oxidase inhibitors in that area as well. So entirely possible, quite plausible that there was a similar formulation to ayahuasca, mixing DMT, MAO, being able to take that DMT experience really stretched out. And then you've got this consistency of experience and shared group experience, which is completely not common with any other type of psychedelic. I think there is a strong basis for psychedelics in there. Yeah, it's not for everyone. Seen people lose their shit on a few mushrooms, but again, that's, you kind of highlight
that makes me curious what the most optimal generalization of their use could be, right? If there's a really strong argument for the role they played throughout the history of these processes, coupled with a lot of scientific evidence about their potential benefits and uses, but they're not for everyone. So when we think about ritual scenarios, to what degree are these substances recommended? Like, is a ritual, if everybody microdoses psilocybin before the ritual, is that a sweet spot? Is that better than nobody does any of it?
I don't know. That would be an exploration point for broader stuff, is to have people microdose and do some testing to see whether anything's going on there. I think low dosing, like say gram to 2 grams, giving these people the option to go through that. If anybody's totally afraid of it and they don't want to do it, like, okay, getting through that first level. So that's like early rite initiation, like rite of passage.
Right.
Take some psilocybin, you come through the door, you do whatever base ritual is there. And okay, that's kind of your first degree, and you're in as a member of whatever else. More psychotropics beyond that, that's for the people who are your shamans within your group, or anybody who wants to pursue that particular track. I think there is a reasonable push for baseline exposure, but beyond that, not prescriptive. It has to be by individual intent.
Sure.
And if you want to go off and do those heroic doses, or you want to get a group to go do those heroic doses together, great. And anybody comes in on the small dose and completely loses their shit, well, you know, there's someone who's got a lot of remediation work to do before they come back. And I would make that kind of contingent. You need to go through this experience in order to come through the other side of the gate. If you don't go through the experience, you haven't crossed the threshold, come back and try again. Like a military selection or whatever else. Like, you need to do the complete exercise in order to come through the door. And if you can't the first time, we'll help train you up. And if you can't, then you just can't. Sorry. Sometimes cookie crumbles that way.
Now I'm thinking about where ritual shades into the self-organizing dynamics of groups and organizations on a regular basis. I was thinking about, I don't know how familiar you are with Forrest Landry's ephemeral group process model, but part of it is people getting together regularly to presence questions and then refine those questions. And then the whole initial phase is just trying to collectively figure out what are the questions we're trying to work on, right? But that's a periodic group quasi-ritual performance, but not designed to be so much like the mystery rituals, designed to be part of the regular.
Very parallel to the Hervera.
Yeah. So how do we build that stuff into the ongoing functioning and self-organization of groups we want to set up?
I think we got to put it on the road and kick the tires a little bit. So that was part of my intent of trying to do the stuff with the practice, both the Shadowgate and the Hervera ritual. It's like, okay, I don't fucking know if it's going to work, but here's the baseline. Let's beat it up and see if it falls apart or stands up. And whatever is integrated basically needs to go through that process. Okay, let's beat the shit out of it and see if it survives. And if it doesn't survive, or it needs some modification in order to survive, we do that. But if it doesn't survive, then we don't fucking need it. It has to stand up to that penetration testing and return on investment in terms of efficacy. If we put something into this, is it actually doing the things in consciousness we think it's doing in terms of building relationships, community, or other aspects? We need to be able to test that. And if it survives to a threshold where we go, yeah, this is now going to be an accepted practice within doctrine, then we integrate that into the Book of Stone. Okay, now it's ready to be chiseled out. It's passed the test.
So
up until that point, you're kind of in a
models, like what concepts or whose models would you consider interesting enough to want to run the experiment on?
In terms of ritual structure, I haven't seen much in the way of other models. The one you just described, that seems quite parallel to what I was trying to do with Hervera, but a little less structured. So I guess Hervera's got the specific representations of those three spaces in terms of psychotechnologies, and then it's got the integration of the physical ritual of building the stone structure. But otherwise, at the fundamentals of that's a parallel thing. Let's get in, break down, decompose, try to have a better more refined understanding of what the questions actually are before we go too far in trying to answer them.
We only briefly touched on the possibility of national scale rituals, but obviously one of the classic things that comes close to being that is the election process. Where do you lean in terms of making that be more effective? Like what's your vision or hunch about, say, voting reform?
I think changing the first past the post is a different thing. And I've just changed a whole lot of shit. Everybody's focused on like 4 year less or 4 years or less cycles. It's really myopic, and it's just about glad handing to get into the next thing. I think we talked about this last conversation. One of the things you're doing in the Masonic Lodge is you're bringing people in at the lowest officers level, and you're incrementing them through, powering them, leveling them up, getting them to understand the entire organization before they have a leadership role. So I think something like that would be good. That within Masonry, you still have that election process. So the officers are elected every year. If you've gone up to like tier 3 and you petered out, and people don't want to vote for you to go advance any further, then that's completely viable. Yes, it does stress the system in that you need someone who's already gone through to come back and fill in until this one comes up and they can jump back out, or you got to bump people up ahead. If you've got more people to work with, that's easier. If you've got a small group of people, that can be a pretty significant challenge. So actually, having no one get into that most high leadership role without showing complete fucking track record all the way up. You have to show that track record with integrity all the way up. And I think the voting is less important at that point. Yes, there's still the vote for all the way up, but you need the track record in order to have the accountability and to break out of this cycle of just like, oh, we got it in the bag. We're pushing for the next election. Here's all of our bullshit promises. Here's fucking pie in the sky policy shit that will never fucking manifest. The other part of that is, in terms of changing the structure, is putting something like TOGAP into the government as like, here's our basis. Here's our enterprise architecture model. Here's how all of our allocations are. Here's all the key performance indicators. And here's quarterly a fucking report on exactly what we're doing with complete transparency. I mean, there are almost no levels of government outside of security apparatus where you've got any fucking excuse not to do that. Coherent model that maps what's actually happening down, and then transparency. And instead of voting on fucking leadership, it's like, okay, this module of, the Ministry of Culture service bus under whatever, we're not seeing what we need to here. It's like, let's vote on where we want to allocate energy, or breaking out the different system buses. If I want to vote on something, and I've got 10 eggs to distribute amongst the different ministries. It's like, I want to put 3 in environment, and I want to put 2 in energy, and I want to put whatever randomly across. Voting on allocation of resources. I mean, we still run into the same mob mentality. Democracy is just mob rule in slow motion, but specificity of the questions. So we're dealing with smaller things that we're able to actually see what's going on, instead of these kind of great grand sweeping gestures where we're not really fucking doing anything. We have no accountability, and we don't even have a clear path conceived before we fucking start out trying to do stuff. I mean, in terms of software development, there's a tradition of, guys like Hal Helms. You put 80% of your energy up front, complete design, laying out absolutely everything, going through this issue of like the back and forth, figuring out exactly what the problems are, figuring out exactly what all the different tracks are, modeling that coherently, and then we spend the last 20% actually just implementing the model, as opposed to we're sculpting and kind of fixing things as we go along, and we put too much energy into this little thing, and we kind of piss that away, and then, oh, now we're behind deadline. Much more emphasis on thinking about what the fuck is going on, and clear intention about applying it.
So group structures need clear intention. They need clear mapping in enough detail for accountability to be in place, and they need adequate transparency. Well, and then we're looking at all of that, and we're making, sorry, do you want to add a thing?
Policy, that's one thing I wanted to come back to you for, because really a lot of these things that we're looking at are policy structures. Policy needs to be clear and simple so that people can actually follow it, and so that it can actually be enforced. So it can't be wandering, vague, blue sky, whatever stuff. It has to be like really clear, really direct. Can people understand it? Can they be held to account for it? And that, if you follow that stringently, that gets rid of a lot of cruft, gets us right down to the core of what's there.
Nice. there's a lot about evaluation in this, right? And you were talking about, does a person have a track record of integrity, and then also like kicking the tires, where and then we comes to the question of what we mean by integrity, or what we're looking for when we kick those tires. What would you say is sort of the cluster of qualities that we should be optimizing for in these processes? When we have the transparency, we have the accountability, what are we checking that against? What qualities are we looking for?
Integrity, I think I'm using the term as internal consistency. So and again, whether this is the modeling of internal personality or the model of map to territory, is it coherent? The more coherent it is, the more there's an aspect of trust in being able to do that. I don't know if that completely answers the question, but I think the integrity aspect is simpler. It's like, is it coherent? Does all the shit line up? Or do you have like all these little blind spots and weird little occlusions that are unaccounted for? Like, is the model coherent within itself and coherent with its relationship to the world?
Sometimes in conversation, I get to a spot where I feel very even.
Yeah.
So that's like an indicator that I might want to shift the way I'm doing it. Is there anything else? We said at the beginning that this would be a good conversation from your point of view if you'd made clear all the things you wanted to say and make clear. Have you done that, or are there more things you'd like to get to here?
I think in terms of the ritual stuff, I've probably covered most of that. Like in what I've laid out in the book, Sepher Ehben, is a section on origin. So like, here's how and why I came to this, or here's the seed of what I'm trying to grow out of this. After that, there's a section of aphorisms, which is some of its pithy little criticisms, or like that one from Temujin to Tenzin, all true battles are within. That I think I wanted to highlight as here's a template of like what I'm trying to do with these aphorisms, and the difference between simple, stupid, simple, elegance, compression. That the one phrase, I think there's enough in there. If you went and pulled all those little threads, there's a lot of rabbit holes down there. But you could go down those rabbit holes and come back to, okay, why was this group of words structured in this way? Who the fuck is Tenzin? Who's Temujin? What the hell is their relationship to each other? And what's all this stuff about battles, which you might figure out if you figure out who Genghis Khan was. But some of them are trying to deconstruct specific conceptual errors, at least as I see them, or problem areas in terms of the way people relate to things. And other ones are like, okay, here's the, what do you call it? Here's the 3 seeds for the beanstalk. Like, okay, go grow this out. What is it doing for you? Like, pull this thing apart, dig into it, decompose it. Can you get to a point where this weird pithy little sentence actually means something of depth? And I think that's the big part of it, is trying to convey at least pointers towards, can't convey depth directly, but at least convey pointers to where depth exists to explore that space. There's other pieces, the hymns to the logos. These are, most of them are written in the form of kind of like slam poetry, to be read, to be shared, to be vocalized with other people in some type of engagement. Right. So I mean, just not to say having a slam poetry session couldn't be a form of ritual if you've got people who are all speaking on topic instead of whatever kind of random shit they usually want to bring to an open stage. I've got a mix of shorter and longer pieces called reveries, which took that from Westworld. Like, here's just kind of getting lost in your own thoughts. Here's a little exploration to go and play with. Like, see what's being conveyed here and pull it apart, tease it apart, try to beat it up. And it's just something to kind of play with on like a lower level meditation, as opposed to the other pieces, which are like, here's an invitation to a rabbit hole or a scent trail. Like, you want to dig and follow it along. And then after that, it was the practice piece. The only other piece outside of that that we didn't touch on was the sacred gesture stuff. So 2 years ago, I think, I did mushrooms, got specifically into this space about figuring out some stuff with sacred gesture, because I found I was at a point where I was doing little hand gestures when I was walking around doing things in order to maintain concentration, stuff like that. I'm like, what the hell's going on with these? So I just took some psilocybin, went into a space to explore that. I had an idea going into it, wanted to go into a psilocybin space to like that high speed Zen thing and just beat the shit out of it and see whether what I went in with would actually come emergent at the other side. So instead of trying to write shit down, I just videoed myself trying to explain each of the 4 symbols, which I think I sent you that link. And then asking my partner, okay, is the stuff that I said in this video here, is this coherent with what I talked about before? And yeah, there was a high degree of coherence that wasn't just me projecting on, yeah, I got it right. So the gesture thing was, it's also patterned off of the Boyd's loop or OODA loop. So corruption, compassion, reflection, resolve. So corruption, the yod, the first letter of the tetragrammaton ahead of the anthropomorphic, is supposed to be the rabbi's finger pointing at God. That if you're not pointing at God, you're pointing away. I also tied something into that about smoking and suppression of speech, suppression of the logos, suppression of truth. So of smoking as a coping mechanism, a lot of time you're just kind of chewing your words down. That is a corruption. At that point, the failure mode, you need to go into compassion. Give it a little bit of space. It's like re-wombing. You're going back, give it a space in order to fall and come back again. Reflection is bringing it back around, repointing towards the highest and pulling intention. What are the two? Sorry. You've got the inflection, you're pulling both sides of your being together, whether it's left brain, right brain, but building that coherence into the reflection. And then resolve is almost like the action of drawing a string on an arrow, related to the idea of sin, or the etymology of sin, of missing the target. So it's like, fucked up, figured out, reflection, figure out, or sorry, fucked up, acknowledge the fucked up, reflect on what caused the fuck up, reassert intention, and move ahead. And that's just kind of a constant process. Like, okay, aim towards target. Okay, fucked up. Acknowledge, re-conceptualize what the appropriate thing is, and then initiate that action up towards it. I think there's room for other type pieces, and that was just something I wanted to explore as a basis for, okay, how do we create a sutra? Or how do we create one of these hand gesture things? How does that process happen? And what do we do with it from there?
Well, this is great, Jason. Thank you. You're clearly sitting on a lot of insights, and not arbitrary insights, experiential and passionate insights. I think what I'll take away from this is a reinforcement of the idea of how important it is to link these experimental and philosophical thought schools with the lineage of mystery traditions and the convergence and future that may afford us. Your sense of how the dynamics of ritual play out, and the importance of tailoring that in a way that's available to the different lenses of the different basic traits.